I love absolutely everything about the Saw franchise, most specifically the story itself overall. Now, granted, my all-time favorite Saw film is Saw 1, then I would have to say Saw 3 because that actually had good character build-up and development. But Saw 1 is like the pinnacle for the early 2000s horror thriller genre for suspense and just the direction of it. And of course, it was directed by James Wan, who directed Insidious and the Conjuring series and one of the Fast and Furious films. And James Wan is a good director. He also directed Aquaman, which is odd to me, but whatever. So, roughly 16, 17 years later, we get a second spin-off series from the Saw franchise and the Saw universe in the form of Spiral from the Book of Saw. And normally, I'm very biased on a positive note for the Saw franchise. Despite the very weak, lackluster visuals that the newest Saws showed off, not so much Jigsaw, because that one, the visuals held up for the most part, but I was always riveted by the stories. And that's what always hooked me. It was the overall, overarching story. It was just all unique and original storytelling and writing to me. Yeah, every Saw is very thin in terms of the narrative itself, but overall the story is just, to me, it's mesmerizing with all of it combined. With that being said, and making sure that my bias is well known, Spiral from the Book of Saw is hands down the worst of anything that came for Saw. I was trying to fight with myself, trying to find one positive thing to say about Spiral. The best I could come up with is it looks better than most Saws, especially the Saws in the past 10 years. It's colorful and the visuals hold up, but otherwise this is just a cheap knockoff of Saw. And it features Chris Rock, Samuel L. Jackson, and Wish.com Brendon Urie. And outside of the acceptable good casting, it also portrays bad visual designs in the props, like the intro tongue trap. The tongue just looked way too morphed. It looked way too long to be a tongue. The story and narrative itself is majorly predictable in that within the first 20 to 25 minutes, I guessed the entire ending of it. But the absolute worst and the cardinal sin of Spiral has to be the editing. The editing just kills everything about the film Spiral from the Book of Saw. The editing is just so poor. It's so improper. It's so overdone that it doesn't just affect the visuals or even the tone or pacing. It also affects the story. The story itself could have actually been a good story this time around if it had been, I would say, a 2-hour Saw film. But because Lionsgate for some reason wanted a quick-paced editing job throughout the whole entire film, we don't really get much character development. We get character development for the main character and his dad and I guess Wish.com Brendon Urie, but that's essentially it. And they do an okay job in terms of those characters, most specifically Chris Rock, his character. But outside of that, everything is either so lackluster and weak or just not practiced or done on at all. And it has to do with the really bad editing. Just, you can't find a single second in this film where it lingers on any kind of emotional impact or resonance from the last scene so that we can absorb what just happened. It just kind of, a scene happens and then another scene happens and then we just continue on to the next part of the story. And that's not good at all. Even for a Saw film. Saw films aren't really known for their mesmerizing, like, story tone or anything. More so the overarching of it all. As far as individual films I'm talking about, like, you can't really pick apart one individual Saw film and just be like, that's great. Except the first Saw, they all just kind of blend together, and because of that makes them actually exceptional. But Spiral from the Book of Saw is not only a spin-off, it's a dumb spin-off, and it also ends on a cliffhanger. For some reason, they're screaming that there's going to be a sequel. I would love there to be a sequel because I love the Saw franchise, but I really don't want to watch another Saw film that is made like this one. I hope that they bring in not so much different writers, but definitely a different director and a different and better editing team, because they brought back Darren Lynn Bousman to direct this one. He was known for a couple of the previous Saw installments, and I think this film would have just benefited from a freshman cast of a production team. Have some new faces and hands in that were looking to just kind of go all out, make their name known. Instead, we get a very weak, very lackluster, and very poorly put together film that is, it's cohesive, but it just feels so disjointed and overwrought at the same time. Like, you can comprehend the story, but it's a bad story and it's a very poorly done story. And all of its major problems stem from the very poor editing job. It's like they took a Saw story and they turned it into a Michael Bay action film, which doesn't make any sense, but that's what this film felt like while I was watching it. It felt like a Michael Bay directed and edited Saw film, and that's a really bad insult for any film, honestly. So, at the end of the day, like I said, if they had expanded the runtime and gotten rid of the quick-paced editing, they expanded it to, say, 2 hours, added in some more character depth, and there aren't many traps in this film, which I get they were trying to do experimental things, and you can tell by that with just the way that it was filmed, but this is a Saw film at the end of the day. We're looking for traps, and you can have less traps in favor of better story and more storytelling, but what we get in Spiral is less traps and even less story than most other Saws. Like, I'm not saying I want another Saw 1. I would prefer that. Saw 1 had a great interwoven story, and we haven't really gotten that ever since the first Saw. Excluding Saw 3, I really liked what they did with the character development, but outside of those two films, I'm still waiting for the next Saw film that they release that actually has a bigger overarching story to it that revolves around the characters. And I get that they tried doing that with Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson's characters, in that the father-son dynamic, as well as expanding the story around a corrupted police force, but literally in that one half of that statement, that's the story. I'm not kidding. That's the entire story. In half of one statement, I just told you the entire story. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to pick this film apart, but I have to. I have to be as objective as possible, set aside my biases for the Saw franchise, and Spiral is a terrible film. They could have done it justice with expanded runtime, different editing team, but we get what we get. So overall for me, Spiral from the Book of Saw is the worst Saw film out there, and it's a 1 out of 10. I was going to give it a 0, but I looked for just one positive. I found one positive to say about it. So Spiral from the Book of Saw, 1 out of 10. Thank you.